Let me welcome all of you again to the last lecture series of this semester. We will go on hiatus until January 23rd, when we'll have Rick Hanushak from Stanford University, one of the leading, if not the leading, economist of education, will be here on January 23rd. He's the, you know, we have our own leading economist of education, Dr. Strauss. I have to qualify by saying one of the leading.
He is
the leading.
He's the father.
He's the father.
But it's likely better.
So I just want to make that point, and then I'll turn things over to Pat Wolf, who will have the honor of introducing Dave Campbell.
Okay, our speaker today, Dave Campbell, loves to bowl. That's not just, well, no, he loves to bowl not alone, but in leagues. And it's not just because he's Canadian, which he is, the pride of Alberta, right?
Medicine Hat.
Yeah, Medicine Hat, Alberta. But it's because he knows that people who bowl in leagues are civically engaged and generate social capital for their communities. I first met Dave about a decade ago when I was doing my first school choice research project with Paul Peterson. And we ran into a data problem. And Paul said, well, I've got this hotshot young student. I think he's the guy to help us out with this. Meet with them and see if you guys can figure it out. So I figured this guy Dave Campbell would be, you know, some stats geek like George, and instead it turns out, you know, that this young man is just very lively, dynamic, interesting, a great team player. You know, the contrast is really stark. And Dave and I proceeded to collaborate on this study with some other folks and some other projects. But Dave really quickly emerged as one of our nation's foremost experts on citizenship, civic values, and the role that education can play in supporting the public vitality of our society. He is the John Cardinal OHara, C.S.C. Associate Professor of Political Science. We ought to get a John Cardinal OHara kind of chair down here. Why don't you work on that, Jim?
As soon as you find the donor.
Okay. At the University of Notre Dame, another university struggling with a transition in its football program.
It's been a 20-year transition, apparently.
Yeah. Well, in those 20 years, Dave has published, he's authored, co-authored, and co-edited a number of important books and major journal articles, and he's here to share with us his more recent research, exploring really a crucial question of do and how can schools impart and enhance the civic values of their students. So, Dave Campbell.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that introduction. I don't know if any of you saw the Al Smith dinner where John McCain and Barack Obama were on stage together, and they, traded jokes back and forth. You might remember that one of McCain's lines is that you want to make sure that you keep your expectations low. And his joke was that he had seen Obama's speech, and he said, "Oh, I don't want to, poison the well here for Senator Obama, but." Man, that is going to be one funny speech. That's going to be the funniest speech you've ever heard. It'll be 15 minutes of pure hilarity, which I thought was actually a pretty good line and a pretty good joke to sort of raise expectations for Obama. And I feel that Pat Wolf may have pulled the John McCain on me here. I'm not sure how dynamic and lively I can possibly be after that introduction. But I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about education and civic engagement. And so I thought I would take a minute and talk just briefly, by way of a general introduction, of why it is that I care about this subject. Because I care a lot about the question of why it is that people are or are not politically or civically involved. And I care, and I wish that more people cared as well about how schools play a role in facilitating civic and political engagement. So my career, such as it is thus far, has been spent trying to figure out the different ways that the places we live, the schools we attend, the churches we attend, those sorts of things, how do they affect whether or not we get politically or civically involved? And today I'm going to talk specifically about what we know, and importantly what we don't know about education, about schools, but also just sort of education more generally, and how it relates to civic engagement. There's actually an interesting lesson here that is embedded, I think, within my talk. The lesson is one perhaps for all social scientists, because the reason that I'm able to give this talk today, which is on this general question of, well, what do we know and don't know about education and civic engagement, is that everyone knows that education is a predictor of whatever civic outcome you want to put into that equation. Voting, whether you volunteer for campaigns, whether you know more about politics, whether you care more about politics, whether you feel more efficacious about politics, doesn't matter. Any of those and any other civic outcomes you might possibly imagine, every single one of them is predicted by one's level of education. Everyone knows that. Everyone has known it for decades upon decades. And so nobody will ever run a model without a model of voting or whatever, without including a control for the education level of those people in that particular sample. In fact, Phil Converse, a well-known political scientist, once went so far as to describe education in a nice metaphor as the universal solvent. Everyone knows education predicts everything. The reason why this is a lesson for social science is that while everyone knows this, very few people have actually tried to figure out, well, why is this the case? So we all include education as a control variable. We all know that it predicts all the various things we're interested in. But frankly, very few people have actually spent a lot of time and attention on just why exactly you see that relationship. And that's certainly relevant to the question of questions related to school choice and sort of more broadly to education reform. Because if we care about civic outcomes, and I do, and I hope you do too, and we think that schools have something to do with whether or not people are more civically and politically engaged, well, we should probably try to figure out what it is about schools, what it is about education that actually matters. What drives that civic involvement, if anything at all? And I'll talk a little bit about why some people think education itself actually doesn't really have an effect. So for example, here's how this might apply to school choice, and this speaks a little bit to some of the work that I've done. If it is the normative climate, for example, within a school, or something about the way things are taught within a school, or the way a school is organized, if that's what facilitates a young person's civic engagement upon passing through that school, well, maybe we ought to go out and study how it is that schools form that strong normative climate. And it might possibly be that school choice is one way that such a climate can be fostered. Now, I don't know if we can go so far right now as to say that it's definitely the case. That's certainly plausible, and it's something worth exploring. But that question can only come up because we already believe or have an intuition that education and civic engagement are somehow related. Okay, so with that sort of introduction, let me just leap into what I want to talk about today specifically. It is well known, I think, that in the United States, over the last few generations, we have seen a rise in the level of aggregate education in the population. It's plateaued a little bit more recently, but if you compare the current generation to the generation before to the generation before that, we all know that levels of educational attainment have risen. Whether or not people actually know more or learn more, that's a separate question. But certainly, in terms of the credential that people have, average levels of education have been rising. And as I said, everybody knows education predicts all these civic outcomes. Well, over the same period that education levels have been rising, we have not seen an increase in all of these civic outcomes. There is a debate among political scientists over whether or not voter turnout is down or flat over that period, but nobody suggests that voter turnout in general is up. It obviously fluctuates. Some elections it's a little higher, some it's a little lower, but the general trend is either down or flat. And then if you move away from voter turnout and look at almost any other civic outcome, and others have exhaustively cataloged this, virtually every other indicator is down, and many of them are down sharply. How could it possibly be that our average levels of education are rising, yet our civic outcomes are either flat or going down? Should they not have also been rising at the same time? That is sometimes called the paradox of participation, and is widely attributed to Richard Brody of Stanford University as one of the first to point that out decades ago. Well, about 10 years ago, there was a book published by Norman Nye, Jane Junn, and Kenneth Stalick Berry. From here on in, I will simply refer to those three as Nye et al. They published a book in which they sought to unravel that puzzle, to explain it. They didn't go so far as to say, well, we can explain why civic outcomes might be down during a period of rising education, but they did say that they could explain why civic outcomes would not go up at the same time that education levels in the aggregate are going up. The reason, they argue, is that education in and of itself, that is the stuff you learn in school, that is not what drives civic engagement. Instead, education serves as a credential. It sorts people socially. Now, that'll sound familiar, I'm sure, to many in the audience, because that same logic has been applied to other things that we study as well. But they applied it specifically to civic engagement. So, in other words, a generation or two ago, if you had a college degree, that set you apart from your peers. And as they would argue, that is Nye et al., that puts you at the center, or was more likely to put you at the center, of your own social networks. So you had what they call social network centrality. In other words, it made you the big cheese, the head honcho. You were the big shot because you had the credential. A generation or two later, having a college degree doesn't carry that same sort of head honcho-ness. It doesn't put you in the center of a social network anymore because everybody else around you has a college degree as well. In other words, there has been education inflation, and so levels of educational attainment are worth less now than they once were. In other words, education sorts people socially, and the way you get sorted is not your absolute level of education that you've earned, but instead how your education relates to those around you. What is your relative level of education? And they call that the sorting model. And so what they show in their book is that if you account for the rising levels of education, that is, you turn education from a measure of just your each individual's absolute level, that's how we typically think of it, but instead think of not just your own level of education, but your educational environment, well then, they show, we wouldn't expect civic engagement to rise at all. We'd expect it to be flat because of this education inflation that goes on. Okay, does that make sense? That's the sorting model that Nye et al. Purport. It is important to note that they do not think that sorting applies to absolutely everything related to civic engagement, because they draw a distinction between engagement, by which they mean behavior, things you do, and what they call democratic enlightenment, things you think. That includes political tolerance, which more accurately should be called respect for civil liberties. That's generally how we measure it, but it's come to be known as tolerance. And also political knowledge. They say, well, if you look at those two things, political knowledge, political tolerance, those do rise as average levels of education in a population rise. So they say, well, that doesn't seem to be affected by the sorting model. So whether or not you are tolerant of people around you, that is, you respect their civil liberties, whether or not you know more about politics, well, that doesn't seem to be a matter of where you are in the social networks surrounding you. It's not whether or not you're a head honcho. It might actually be something that you've learned in school. What I want to do today is take issue with Nye et al. Because if you think about what they're saying, if they are right, A, every model we've ever run that includes education as a predictor of civic engagement is misspecified, because we should be accounting for the educational environment. So that's a statistical point, and some people might roll their eyes and say, oh, blah, blah, blah. There's actually a deeper policy-oriented point here, that if they're right, that schooling, education itself doesn't actually predict civic engagement. It's just a matter of where your educational credential puts you on a social ladder, whether or not it makes you the head honcho. If that's what matters, well then we ought not to pay any attention, not worry at all about trying to foster civicness within the schools, because it's not going to make any difference. The only thing that's going to matter is whether or not you have more educational attainment than the people around you. It's the credential that matters. It's not what actually occurs inside the school or inside your head that matters. If that is true, it would mean that people like me would be out of business. And I don't like that idea. So I thought, well, I want to think a little harder about Nye et al. And what's really contained within their model. So over the next few minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Nye et al. Model, and essentially I'm going to attack it. But I want to be clear that I'm only able to do this because their book is actually a work of model social science, and there's much to admire here. And you'll see by the end, actually, I'm not going to say that they're totally wrong. I'm just going to say that their model is much more limited than they once suggested. But for those who might be in graduate school or are just sort of interested in reading a good example of how social science operates, their book, Education and Democratic Citizenship in America, actually is a very good example. They have an elegant model. It has clearly laid out assumptions. It's not a heavily formal model. They're able to state it verbally. But they're able to lay it out. It has a number of implications that follow from it, and they test it in a variety of different ways. In fact, I'm only able to give this talk because they have done such a good job in laying out the various assumptions in their model, and that is actually to their credit. So I just want to make sure I'm clear on that. Okay, so what I want to do is now dive deep into the assumptions that Nye et al. Make in order for their model to work. The first is the idea that civic engagement, and at breakfast today we were talking about how that's a wonderfully amorphous term, and I'm going to stick with it because it is amorphous, and you'll see that it covers a lot of ground, and that's deliberate. They perceive civic engagement, broadly construed, as a competitive enterprise, such that civic engagement, political engagement of all sorts, involves a zero-sum competition. So this is a direct quote from their book. We argue that certain aspects of democratic citizenship are in fact bounded or limited by their essentially competitive nature. The instrumental behaviors and cognitions of political engagement can be seen as more of a zero-sum game, bounded by finite resources and conflict, where one's gain will necessarily be another's loss. In other words, the reason that it matters that you are in the center of your social network, that you are the head honcho, is that you have an edge on the others in the network, and therefore you are more likely to have your voice heard by government officials. That is at the core of their model. That people get involved in politics because of conflict. That conflict is bounded, as they say. It involves a zero-sum competition. And therefore, only a few will ever have their voices heard. And because we are all engaged in that competitive system, it will only be the case that those who are at the very top will be the most engaged because they're the ones who are the most likely to be heard. Okay? I want to be clear on that, because while I agree with them on the idea that education can affect your social status, I do not necessarily agree with them that this is the way all civic activity works. Now notice that I just used the word civic, not political, and I draw a distinction between those terms. When I say political, I mean those activities that are actually directed toward affecting policy. Civic activity is also collective action, but it's not necessarily directed toward a policy outcome per se. They do not differentiate between those things. Why would we care about that? Well, let me show you another quote from theirs, in which they argue that not only working on campaigns, writing letters to your member of Congress, that sort of thing, not only is that competitive, but so is group membership. Again, a direct quote from Nye et al. Membership in voluntary associations is, we expect, the result of relative rather than absolute educational attainment. Okay, that's the sorting model. Members of associations obtain substantial psychic and social rewards for their organizational involvements. Moreover, voluntary membership requires time, energy, and often money. And those who are relatively near the center of the social network can better afford to pay the costs and are more likely to reap the benefits. I do not agree with this statement. I am willing to believe that there are some groups for which you obtain social status by belonging to them. But I do not believe, and hopefully by the end of this talk you will not believe, that most group memberships in America are driven by this mechanism. Most people do not belong to bowling leagues because they seek social status. Most people do not coach their kids' soccer teams because they're doing so in order to achieve social status. There are some groups, I will admit, where that may be the mechanism in operation, but I am willing to argue that that is not the way that most group memberships operate. Extending that even further, it is not the way that many other forms of civic activity work. Some may be competitive, but certainly not all. Now, I've started with this particular critique of Nye et al. Because I want to show that the assumptions that they make are critical to understanding how it is that their model proceeds. And so if we don't agree with the assumptions, well, we wouldn't expect the rest of the model to proceed as they suggest. Now, I'm not alone in critiquing Nye et al. While there's not been a huge amount of literature that's taken them on, there have been a couple of articles. One is written by Stephen Tenn. Tenn looks at the measures that Nye et al. Use, and he critiques the way they operationalize the educational environment. That's the term they use for who you're comparing yourself against or who you're being compared to when we're looking at your education level relative to others. Because Nye et al. Actually pay attention not just to the overall education level, but how you compare to people in your age cohort. But they use kind of a quirky definition of your age cohort. And here it is. They compare your educational attainment against the educational attainment of everyone who was between the ages of 25 and 50 when you were 25. What that means in operation is that you never compete in their model against people who are younger than you. You are always competing against people who are older than you, and only up until 25 years beyond your age. And in addition, you are competing against people who might even be dead. Because remember, it was people who were 25 to 50 in the year that you were 25. That's their definition of educational environment. So Stephen Tenn says, well, that's a problem. And he goes and he fixes that, and he says, well, let's measure educational environment in a different way. And he does so using the current population study, which has a much finer-grained measure of education. And he says, well, when you do that, you get some fixes. And you get slightly different results, but you get basically the same story as Nye et al. So it's a critique, but at the end of the day, he sort of says, well, it looks like there's still something to this idea. A more telling critique comes from Hallowell and Putnam. They look at Nye et al.'s argument, and they say, well, here's another problem with it. Not only do we have this age issue, which they also raise, Nye et al. Are also saying that the educational environment that matters is national in scope. That is problematic because average levels of education vary dramatically across the United States. So a college degree might actually matter a lot more in Valparaiso, Indiana, not far from where I live, than it does in Berkeley, California. That is, it's more likely to set you apart from everyone around you in one place versus another. Does that make sense? And so what Hallowell and Putnam do is they say, well, let's look at educational environment not nationally. They just divide it up by census region. And they don't even say that that's the best way to go about this. It just happened to be a convenient way. And they say even when that's all you do is you break up educational environment by the census regions, which are big swaths of territory, cover multiple states, each one of them. Well, then you actually do not find evidence for educational sorting the way Nye et al. Suggests that it operates. So those are two existing critiques of Nye et al. I'm going to take them both a little bit further. And I'm going to take them both seriously because I'm going to account for both age and place in the model that I present. Because what I want to do is reconceptualize what we mean by the educational environment that you're in. So the first thing I'm going to do, keeping to the spirit, I think, of both the critiques of Ten and Hallowell and Putnam, is I'm going to compare each individual, their education level, to the average educational attainment of people in these four age cohorts. And these happen to be the standard age cohorts that the Census Bureau uses. So I didn't just make them up out of whole cloth. And we can argue back and forth of whether these are where the right cut points are. But hopefully you can get an appreciation that if you're between the ages of 25 and 34, you're being compared against people who are roughly your age, and you're not being compared against people who are over the age of 65. And maybe it's the case that that should be 25 to 40 rather than 25 to 34 or something. But if that's true, that's actually sort of an argument in favor of why what I'm suggesting to you doesn't work. And since I'm hopefully going to convince you that what I show you does work, well, maybe if we refined it even further, we'd actually find even more compelling results. But nonetheless, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to focus on these four age cohorts. And then I'm also going to look at different educational environments. I'm going to look at the educational attainment of people in your age cohort within your state, within your metropolitan area, or if you do not live in a metropolitan area, your county, and then also within your zip code. So the idea is that we're moving closer in to where you are. None of these are perfect measures, obviously, of your own actual social network. And in fact, the zip code that you live in is not even a geographic area per se. It just happens to be a little smaller than your MSA or your county. So I was able to use it, and I don't suggest that these are the ideal educational environments. I could think of other ways to get at how you might be comparing yourself or how you might be compared against those around you. We just don't have data for those. So this is a case where better data would undoubtedly mean a better analysis, but this is what we have. So that's what I'm going to use. Now, what I'm going to do is use individual level data, and I'm going to match each individual to either the state, the metropolitan area, or the zip code in which they live. And within that state, metropolitan, or zip code, I'm going to compare their educational attainment to those people who are of their same age cohort. Okay, does that make sense? So simultaneously, we'll be accounting for age and place. And I'm going to do so using a study, some data, that was collected by a group of scholars funded by the Pew Charitable Trusts, who had the charge to figure out all the different ways that Americans get involved in civic and political life. And the reason why this was an important effort is that we have been using the same measures essentially since the 1950s, that a group of researchers at the University of Michigan came up with as a way to measure how involved people are in civic and political life. And well, the concern was what people did in the 50s might not match what they're doing today. So we should go out and figure out how people get involved in civic and political life today. So Cliff Zukin and Scott Keeter and their team of researchers spent a lot of time meeting with focus groups, running test surveys, analyzing those surveys, going back to those focus groups, doing all the things that social scientists do to figure out how it is that people actually get involved in civic and political life. And it turns out that some of the things that they came up with match what we've been asking for decades, so that's a good thing. But they also added a few. And more importantly, they're able to show that all these various things, and they came up with 19 of them that they put into a single index, that all those various things can actually be divided into 4 distinct forms of engagement. And this is absolutely critical for the argument that I want to make. So one of them, as you can see here, is the electoral index. This is whether or not you work on a campaign, whether you contribute money to political campaigns, whether you display buttons, whether you work to persuade others to vote a certain way. Those are all electoral activities, and they all sort of go together. They cluster as one factor, but more generally you can sort of think of them as things that if you do one of them, you're likely to do the others. Then they have what they call an expressive index, or at least that's the term I'm going to use to describe it. And these are things that involve you expressing your opinion. You contact officials, you contact the print media, you protest, you sign petitions, you boycott, you boycott. So a boycott is where you avoid particular businesses because you don't like something that company does. A boycott is where you choose to shop in a place because you like the particular policies of that company or firm. And those things go together. Okay? So that's another bundle of activities that fit together. Then we have the civic index, which includes belonging to a group or association. So there's your bowling. But it also includes volunteering for non-political things, which is the overwhelming majority of volunteering in the United States. It involves participation in fundraising, runs and walks, and various a-thons that people do. And then we also separate out voting. There's a mountain of research that shows that voting just doesn't work like every other form of activity. It's a unique blend of both symbolic and instrumental motivations, and so it's just sort of kept out on its own. Okay, now the reason that I want to emphasize that I'm able to separate out these 4 different types of activity is that I want to suggest to you that sorting, if we find it, would only be observed in one form of engagement, the electoral index, because that is the only type of these 4 that is intrinsically competitive. However, the mechanism that I suggest is at work here is not the same as Nye et al. So what they say is, remember, you have more education than your neighbors. That puts you in the center of your social network. That makes you the head honcho. That means that you are more likely to have your voice heard by your elected officials. Therefore, you are more likely to get involved with politics. I don't think it works that way. Go ahead.
Why wouldn't you put voting in that category?
Because empirically, it doesn't fit.
But I mean in terms of being competitive.
Well, do I have a board I can write on?
Zero-sum.
Can I write on this?
Sure.
It won't. Well, I won't write. I don't want to screw things up. The reason, Bob, is that voting is not driven by the same kind of competitive sense. And I can say that confidently because I actually wrote an entire book and made that argument. So just briefly, everybody in the room, so this is a tangent, but it's an interesting one. Trust me. And it's a plug for my book. So everybody in the room is going to have the intuition, undoubtedly, that as political competition rises, as elections get closer, voter turnout goes up, right? Everybody would expect that, right? It turns out that voter turnout is equally high in places in the United States that have the least competitive elections, but it drops off in between. And I've written an entire book trying to explain, well, why is it that we'd find high voter turnout in places where elections are not competitive? And the reason is, well, voting has this competitive aspect to it, but it also has this symbolic aspect that involves more a sense of your civic obligation and civic duty, and that's greater in some places than others. So that's why.
It's the bad coffee.
It's the bad coffee.
Yeah, they give you coffee, you know, at polling place. With your, neighbors that you know.
Well, actually, it would be more, and I think we should do this to encourage voter turnout. If you got a sticker that said I voted, some communities do this.
Like I gave blood today.
Yeah, because it sort of is a social reinforcement. But anyway, okay, that's another point. Okay, so what I'm suggesting is that this competitive stuff only matters here, okay? But, and this is, well, my laser disappeared. Here it is. Only matters here, but for a different reason than Nye et al., right? So I was describing how they say education puts you in the center of your social network. What I think happens is if you have more education, it means that you are more likely to have a stake in the outcome of the election. And that doesn't mean that you are going to be the only person getting involved in the campaign. In fact, quite the opposite. If you really want your guy to win, isn't this how campaigns work? You want to get more people involved. You don't want to be the only one volunteering for the campaign. You want to volunteer for the campaign and get lots of your friends to do the same, right? You don't want to be the only one giving the money. You want to give the money and get everybody else you know to give the money as well. That politics has a more the merrier principle applied to it. Okay. And I do not think that the sorting model would apply to the civic index at all for the reasons I described earlier. So this is group membership and things that are like group membership. I'm a little less clear about the expressive index because you might think that some of these things, say protesting, for example, or even contacting elected officials, well, that might have a competitive aspect to it. In some cases, you could imagine a protest that was in favor of a particular bill or against a particular bill, so there would actually be a crystallized outcome. You could win or lose the way you would in an election. But on the other hand, a lot of these expressive activities are actually done on behalf of what are sometimes called valence issues. So people will protest in favor of a good environment. You know, who's against a good environment? Or it's just simply expressive. It's actually not for the purpose of instrumentally achieving a particular policy outcome at all. It's just a social activity. It's something to do. It's driven by something other than competition. And then voting, as I was just saying, is sometimes driven by competition. It has this other bundle of civic motivations as well that mean that I would not expect it to be driven by educational sorting. So, when you put everything together that I've just described, you end up with 3 hypotheses. And often when people give a presentation like this, they'll have multiple hypotheses and they're going to test one after another. I'm actually going to test all of these simultaneously, and you'll see why. And I'm going to start with the last one, the electoral hypothesis, which is what you just heard me say. The sorting model should only apply to electoral activity. That's the strongest statement of the hypothesis. Maybe it applies to the expressive stuff, doesn't apply to the civic stuff. I wouldn't expect it to apply to voting. The geography hypothesis. The smaller the geographic area that defines your educational environment, the closer we are to capturing your actual social networks, the environment that matters. So you'd expect that the metropolitan area being smaller than the state, comparing those two, the metropolitan area should have the effect, not the state. And if the zip code is even smaller than the metro area, it should have an even greater effect. That's the geography hypothesis. And the third is the interaction hypothesis. And this is sort of a more technical point that I argue that what Nye et al. Are proposing is actually an interaction between your own educational attainment and the average level of education in your environment. But they don't model it as an interaction. Instead, what they do is just simply put into one model your own educational level and then the average education level of the environment. And they interpret a negative coefficient on the environment as evidence for sorting. I don't think that's what their theory actually calls for. What it actually calls for is a literal interaction between those two things, which means that the more education you have in your environment, that is, the more educated the people around you, the less your own education should predict the various civic outcomes that they're modeling. And that's just a simple matter of multiplying your own education level times the educational attainment within the environment. Okay, so that's a lot to get your brain around, but hopefully by stating the 3 hypotheses, you can keep them in mind. So we only expect sorting to apply to electoral activities. We expect to find sorting, should it exist, in smaller geographic areas rather than larger ones. And we expect to observe it through this interaction between your own education and the education within your environment.
Why is the interaction multiplying? Why not divide? I mean, if you multiply, then if either one is bigger, then it's going to make it bigger.
Well, that's true if you're only looking at the coefficients, but you can, and I'll do this, you can plot it out and see how it all shakes out, whether when you manipulate both the terms in the interaction and the 2 main effects, what the resulting picture looks like. I'm also going to control for a bunch of other stuff. Each one of these could be their own talk. Why do we think that gender would matter? Why does race matter? Why does marital status matter for civic engagement? I'm not going to talk about those things. I'll do the usual, we can talk about them in the Q&A, but I'm sure we actually won't. But if you want to, we can. Basically, all I've done is just replicated all the various controls that Nye et al. Include in their model. Okay. So we want to make sure that when we're modeling education, we're not really picking up some other difference between people who are more educated and less educated, like their marital status, or whether they're homeowners, or their age, or whatever. Okay, so here is the big result. Don't worry, I'm only going to show you a few tables and mostly pictures. But I did want to make the point that this table shows you, first of all, evidence for, let's start with the geography hypothesis. You're only looking at the electoral index. I'll show you results for the other forms of engagement in a moment. Okay? And here we have your educational environment defined by the state you live in. Here it is by the metropolitan area or the county. And here it is by your zip code. When we look at the state, again, we're modeling this as an interaction when the 2 things are multiplied together. When we look only at the state, there is no significant effect. The coefficient is about the same size as the standard error. When we look at the metropolitan area, you now see that the standard error drops. The coefficient is a little different, a little bigger. But the standard error drops, and so now it is marginally significant. But when we look at the zip code, then we see 2 stars. That makes us very happy, and we know that this is very significant. Okay? That is evidence, I would suggest, for the geography hypothesis. As the geographic area got smaller, we see a greater effect, or more accurately, we can be more confident in that effect. We also see evidence for the interaction hypothesis. Here's education times educational environment. Okay? But of course I can't say anything about the electoral hypothesis because I've only shown you results for one of the 4 forms of engagement. So let me show you the others. And I'll come back to those pictures in a moment. No effect for voting. I'm using here the zip code as the educational environment, but the results are the same whether I use the metro area or the state, and there are only so many tables we can all put up with, right? So I'll just show you one. Here it is for voting, no effect. Here it is for the expressive index, no effect. Here it is for the civic stuff, again, no effect. Okay, so this is what Jay and I were talking about. Here is visual evidence for the sorting effect. Let me walk you through this because sometimes it can be a little difficult to kind of get your brains around how an interaction works. Down here, we have years of education. And here we have the electoral index. You would expect, based on those decades and decades and decades of research, to see an upward sloping line, which would mean as an individual's education level rises, as you have more education, you're more likely to be involved in electoral activity. Right? That's what I said was the standard relationship you find wherever. What I've done here is I've broken out people by their educational environment. So the solid line is whether you are in an educational environment at the 90th percentile. That's a highly educated place. That's Cambridge, Massachusetts. Okay. This line, with the it's dotted, but it has the longer bars. It's at the 50th percentile. It's the average level of educational attainment. So that is probably Peoria, right? We always pick Peoria. Will it play in Peoria? And then the dotted line with the small lines, that is a place at the 10th percentile of educational attainment. In other words, a place where you do not find much education. I will leave it. Well, I don't want to offend anyone, so we'll just leave it.
Virginia.
It's not Arkansas, though.
We always pick on Mississippi, don't we? Okay. That's how it works. Especially
Okay, it's Mississippi.
superior.
Okay.
Yeah, tomorrow's game. Yeah.
Here's the evidence for sorting. In the 10th percentile, that is in Mississippi, where people around you don't have much education, the more education you have, the more involved you are in electoral activity. Okay? Now compare that to Cambridge, Massachusetts. If you have a college, well, it doesn't actually show a college degree, but that would roughly be 16 years of education. But the more education you have in Cambridge, Massachusetts, it makes you a little more likely to be involved in electoral activity, but not a lot more. And quite a big difference between living in Cambridge and living in Mississippi. In fact, that difference between that point there and that point there, so the difference between having 18 years of education and living in Cambridge versus living in Mississippi, that gap is as big as the difference between someone who has a high school diploma and someone who has a master's degree if we were not accounting for the educational environment. And in my world, where we're using education to predict stuff, that is an enormous gain. That is huge. The difference between someone with only a high school diploma and a master's degree, that's a big jump. And that's the gap you see there. You had a question?
So people should be moving from Berkeley to Mississippi
Yeah,
to exert greater political
Yes, if you want to have more, you want to be more of a head honcho, and you have a college degree, get out of Berkeley, get out of Cambridge, and move to Biloxi.
What's interesting to me about this graph, what you had said up to this point led me to think that it would be 3 more or less parallel lines. Okay, but they're not. They have this difference in the slope that you have identified here, which is interesting. But it also points to, what's going on at 12. That it doesn't matter.
That's exactly right.
I would think the 10th percentile educational environment, if being a high school graduate's not bad.
Well,
And being in the 90th percentile is, these are very different relative positions, I would think, for someone with 12 years of education.
but remember, and maybe I didn't highlight this up, this is only for 25 to 34-year-olds. They have to break this out by age. I'm going to show you in a moment what happens when you look at the people who are older. So these are 25 to 34-year-olds, okay, where well, you can see sort of where their lines are. Keep that in mind when we go to the next slide.
I just wanted to make sure I understood the model. This is the relative,
Yes.
but you're controlling for actual.
Yep.
Actual is in there.
Yep. Yeah, because what I'm modeling here is your own education level, okay, interacted with the educational environment.
But your absolute is also in the
Yep.
progression.
Yep. Yeah, and I'm accounting, so this is actually kind of tricky with interaction terms. Sometimes people will get lazy and they'll just change the values of on the interaction term without remembering that you actually have to change the values of the main effects, that is the two things in the interaction, in order to make sense out of the picture. That's what I was saying to Jay earlier, and how you interpret these interaction terms, because just the coefficient itself can be ambiguous. Okay, these are 65 plus year olds, and I just want you to note this. First of all, see where those lines are, where they are. Okay. Notice they all move up, right? Because 65-year-olds are more likely to be civically involved. Also, what do you notice about the slopes? They're all steeper, and that is also evidence for the sorting effect, because average levels of educational attainment for 65-plus-year-olds they're just lower all the way around. So even in the more highly educated environment, here, you still get quite a kick from an increase in your education level, just not as much as you would living in Mississippi, but you still get a kick, because when you're over 65, having a college degree really does make you stand out from those around you, because college degrees are just not as common among this segment of the population. Okay, that's more evidence, I would say, of sorting as applied to this one form of activity when operationalized the way I've described. I won't talk about that. Let me just quickly note, remember I said that Nye et al. Drew a distinction between civic engagement and civic enlightenment? Engagement was behavior, stuff you do. That's all I've talked about thus far. Well, we also have measures of what they call enlightenment. I'll admit that's not a term I particularly like, but it's there, so I'll stick with it. I also have measures of political knowledge, and I have measures of loosely political tolerance, more accurately respect for civil liberties, or in this particular question, it's whether you approve of a controversial speech being given in your community. So these are not great measures, but it's what I have to work with. And again, I model your own education times your educational environment. Okay? What you see here is, interestingly, a very different result. You see, before, you saw a negative coefficient there. That's what produced the lines that we saw. Now you see a positive coefficient. And if you read this carefully, you'll see that the order of the 10th, the 50th, and the 90th percentiles have been flipped. So now it's the 90th percentile that has the sharpest slope, and the 10th percentile that has, well, a slope that's not quite as sharp. What does that mean? Verbally, what that means is the more educated the people around you, the more, in this case, knowledgeable are you about politics. Okay? And here's where the interaction comes in. The more education you have, the more knowledgeable you are as a function of all those knowledgeable people around you. In other words, there is an amplification effect. So you have more college education, or more education generally. That means you're more likely to know stuff about politics. Put that same person in an environment where they're surrounded by others who have still more education, and it amplifies what they know about politics. Okay, so it's the opposite mechanism of the sorting effect. It's what I call the amplification effect. And interestingly enough, Nye et al. Actually proposed this as a mechanism, although they never actually tested in their book. They suggested this is actually what you would expect to see happen. And here's the same thing for political tolerance. Now, I cannot here tell you that this amplification effect is because of what Nye et al. Suggest is happening, which is contagion. What they suggest happens is if you know a lot about politics and you're around people who know more about politics, your own level of political knowledge increases. And that's the same thing for tolerance. We don't know that's the case, because these data would be perfectly consistent with a story that says that if you know a lot about politics, you go and choose to live in a place with other people who know a lot about politics. Actually, you're probably choosing to live in that place for other reasons, but it just so happens that you end up with people who know around you who know a lot about politics. So I don't know whether this is contagion or not, but I put it out there as sort of an interesting wrinkle on the way educational environments work. I'll skip over this. Which brings me to my conclusion. Relative education, the sorting model, does matter. But it only matters for one form of engagement, only for electoral activity, not all those other forms. Okay? And it turns out that Americans do a lot more of the other stuff than they do electoral activity. So we're in the middle of election season. It's easy to forget that because we're all seeing people get engaged in the presidential campaign. But as the full gamut of activities go, electoral stuff is on the low end and bowling leagues is on the high end. But you only find the sorting effect when you account for both age and place simultaneously, and when you model sorting as interactive. And this is the slide I didn't show you. And it turns out that you only find this effect for men, not for women. So what does that all mean? What is my bottom line conclusion? Well, maybe it turns out that education is not simply a sorting mechanism. There might be a little bit of sorting that goes on, but maybe education does something else as well. And I'll have to come back to give another talk to explain what I think it is about education that really does drive these things. Actually, the real answer to that is I wish we had a better sense of why it is that education predicts civic engagement, because the sad fact is we don't, and we should. And that's a charge to all of us, I think, who are engaged in education research to take civic outcomes more seriously. Thank you.
Okay, well, we've got about 15, 20 minutes. Questions for Dave? I'm going to take the prerogative of the first question. Dave, to what extent do you think the differential between the first results you presented and the second, the behavior versus attitudinal, might be based on different sort of social rewards that people receive for behavior versus attitudes? I mean, you might say that there are strong social rewards for having attitudes consistent with the people around you, but there also are social rewards for having behavior that's different, sort of above or exceptional relative to the people around.
I like this because I'm a norms guy, so I'm fully willing to believe that civic engagement is largely driven by norms that vary across. So that's what basically you're saying, right? There's a norm regarding the attitudes you're supposed to have. There are things that you are and are not allowed to say in polite company. And that would explain why, if you're in a more educated environment, you'd be more likely to be tolerant, and that your own college education would in turn drive that, because that's who you're associating with, right? You're around all those people who know what it is you're supposed to say in polite company. But help me understand why the other part of that would work. Why is it that you would want to stand out for your civic engagement?
Because, then you've distinguished yourself in terms of your behavior. You're the person who is more active on those electoral things, and people actually admire that behavior that's distinguishing you, because you're doing something above and beyond the call. So in a sense, there could be social rewards for conformity when it comes to attitudes, and sort of distinctiveness when it comes to behavior.
Well, I think that speaks to, just talking specifically about electoral activity, where we do find the sorting effect. I think that actually speaks to a fundamental question of why it is we think people get involved in electoral activity. That if you believe that people give money to, volunteer for, put signs up for a particular candidate because they actually want to see that candidate win, would it not be the case that you would actually not want to stand out for your support because you want to see your candidate win? And the way you do that is it's a matter of who gets the most votes, right? So you want to bring more people on board. Does that response make sense? I'm also not sure that in the contemporary United States, you do get many social rewards for being known as the guy in your neighborhood who is really politically engaged. In fact, I wonder if it might work the other way, that if you're the one that everybody knows is the political junkie, maybe that makes you weird. No? You're not convinced?
Make sure you go to the door when you...
Since I work all with political junkies, I don't.
Well, but actually, but this is an important point that always comes up whenever we talk about civic and political activity in the general population. That one of the reasons why I think academics are really bad at reasoning through how it is that political and civic activity works, this is probably true for lots of other things we study too, is because we are all embedded in our own social networks, and our social networks are weird. We're not like everybody else. And that's like lesson number 1 when I'm speaking to graduate students. Never generalize from your own experience. The very fact that you're sitting in a graduate seminar studying political science or education or economics, that means you are not like everybody else.
What does your model tell us about the current election?
Is that a serious question? In the back. I'll get to people in the front too, but.
You said that only for men, and I'm curious as to why that was the only tip.
Well, can I go back to that actually? Because I would like, if it's all right, to get. Well, here's the slide. Your thoughts on this. I wasn't sure how much time we had left, which is why I wanted to sprint to the end. So when I initially did all this analysis, I didn't break people up by gender or race or any of the other categories. I just stuck with age and place. It seemed like that was complicated enough, and you'd probably agree as I tried to walk through all of that. But then I sent this out for review, and the reviewers generally liked it. But one of them came back and said, oh, well, wouldn't it be interesting to look at gender differences? And I thought, well, there's probably not going to be any gender differences, but I'll test anyway. Well, I did find one, which is a bit of a conundrum, actually, because I don't have a good explanation for this. So what you see here, just to make clear, this is electoral activity. Okay, it's 25 to 34-year-olds, but the age in this case doesn't matter so much. It's a gender effect that applies across age categories. Okay. Here's men. Okay, remember what we were saying earlier, that if the line is flat, or the flatter the line, the more you find educational sorting. Okay, so a sharpward sloping line upward, that's for women, that means that you do not find educational sorting. In other words, relative education matters for men, but absolute education seems to matter for women. Does that all make sense, what I'm saying? I do not have a good explanation for this, and I would be curious if anyone here does.
Well, my explanation is that for men, or for a lot of men, politics is a competitive activity. You're thinking, all right, we get this little office, and we get that little office, and we move up. Whereas for women, I think are doing it a little more because they're taught in school it's a good thing you're supposed to do, you're a good citizen, all that. So sort of the old materialistic versus idealistic.
Right. So your I like that actually. So your argument would be that men have a more instrumental purpose for being involved in politics. Remember, these are not whether you hold office; this is whether you're involved.
There's a lot of research going back decades showing that men versus women. Look at the old party activism studies.
Would part of it also be explained by your 90th percentile is men and women? Mm-hmm. So maybe within that 90th percentile, there aren't as many women that would have that advanced education. So it might not be an accurate reflection of their academic community.
Right, that is a good question. And I went back and forth on this, whether I should break out your electoral environment. So I did it by age and by place, and should I also do it by gender? I didn't. So here your educational environment includes both men and women. And the reason that I did that, but maybe I shouldn't have, is that I thought, well, if what's really happening here is this competition, isn't it the case that men and women compete against each other? That's certainly true in the labor market, right? And therefore, if I only looked at the educational environment of one gender versus another, I wouldn't really be capturing the full scope of competition defined by your environment. But maybe you don't buy that, because I went back and forth on this. I wasn't quite sure which one made the most
So in
sense.
this chart here, are you comparing women to women and men to men?
Well, I'm actually doing both, actually. So what the way you do this is, you thought it was complicated, you actually add a third term to the interaction. So now it's your own education times the educational environment times your gender. So within a single model, I can compare men versus women. But the nature of the model is such, because both men and women are in there, you're comparing women against women and men against men as well.
So, I mean, to what degree, though, do we have confidence that education is a causal factor in all of this, and that it's not just related from some inherent abilities that lead to these educational outcomes?
Well, we don't know that. Right? And so what I would hope the bottom line of my presentation would be, we don't know it, but we should find out. If all the stuff was just driven entirely by sorting, then there would be no need to sort that out because it's all just a matter of your credentials. If it's not your credentials, well, then what is it? And maybe it's not schools, maybe it's something else, but we should know that. Are you thinking that that question applies to the gender question?
No.
No. Okay. Darn.
I hadn't thought that yet, actually. I hadn't got that far.
I don't dare want to say that men or women are more or less likely to be engaged
I mean,
in
wouldn't we
politics.
expect people who are smarter to pursue more advanced degrees?
Well, yes, if you
Maybe
think
that
it's
effect
sort
is
of...
amplified by gender. Are men in general more likely to get advanced degrees?
I'm not.
No.
Don't answer that if you want to be president of Harvard.
I don't have my doctorate, so this may be a dumb question, but explain to me why women start at that factor at between 0.5 and 0.6. What does that mean versus a man starts at 0.9? What does that mean?
That's a good question. This index is all of those activities, whether or not you've contributed to a campaign, contributed money, whether you volunteered for a campaign,
Okay.
and I just simply added them up.
But does that mean that men, if I'm reading that right, participate more?
Yes.
With a I'm going to say 12 years of
Yep.
education. Is that sort of like high school?
Yep.
Degree? So men start off participating
Yes.
more? Okay.
Yep, that's exactly what that means. And the metric here is a bit weird. They participate by about 0.4 activities, which doesn't mean much when you're talking about an individual. How can you participate in 0.4 more things? But in the aggregate, it just means on average, men are more likely to be doing this stuff than women. And that is generally true when you look at electoral stuff. Men are more likely to be involved in that, generally speaking. Other forms of civic activity, things that are not so explicitly political, women are a little more likely to be involved in them. It depends on what you're looking at. Jay has been dying to get in.
The Nye et al. Argument was an attempt to explain the paradox of rising educational levels but flat to declining civic outcomes, right? And if your analysis is right, your conclusions are right, then outside of the arena of the electoral index, we're still left with the paradox.
Yes.
Right? So we're still left with the task of trying to explain how it could be that educational levels have been rising and yet civic activity, excluding electoral activity, has been declining. And so what are the other potential answers to this? And could I offer one, and I don't know if it's been examined, which is everyone looks at attainment as the measure of education. But if your last line in your conclusion was right, that it matters what exactly people are taught, then maybe there's been a changing mix of what people have been taught over time, so that even people with more attainment now are not being taught as many of the things that would produce civic activity as they used to be taught. And so that really the mistake is in confusing attainment with being taught things that are relevant to civic activity.
I agree 100% with that assessment and would say that has a very strong intuition behind it, that something changed in what we teach. There have been a few articles that have proposed what it is that changed. That there was once a time when you were in school, you were actually taught that voting was an obligation. It was something that you should take seriously. You were encouraged in a very normative way. Like it was okay to tell kids that you really should be doing this. And basically, because of political scientists influencing the way high school civics texts were written, that was sort of removed out of the picture. So you don't get as much of that now. You certainly don't get it at the college level. And the argument is you get less of it at the high school level. I don't know whether we actually know that that's the case. And I don't know whether we have a good sense of whether, even if that were the case, it would actually have the effect of driving civic engagement down. This goes back to the data problem that I was describing earlier. We do know this. This goes back to my book. We do know that if you Maybe not.
Everything goes back to your book.
Exactly. It makes a great gift for office parties, mitzvahs, wedding presents. It's called Why We Vote, by the way. We do know this. If in 1965, and I can only say this about 1965 because it's the only place where we have the data, but if in 1965 you attended a high school that had a strong civic climate, I call it, which means that the students around you said that to be a good citizen, you must vote. So they were actually asked that question on a survey, what does it mean to be a good citizen? And the higher the percentage of students around you in your senior class, actually in the entire high school, who answered voting, or voting regularly, that has a long reach into the future. So that predicts whether or not you turned out to vote in 1980, 15 years later. Whether or not you answered that question saying that voting was something that all good citizens should do. That does not have the effect. It's whether or not the people around you said it. And that's also accounting for basically anything else we could think of that might have a long-term effect on your civic engagement, including how involved your parents were in politics. If what I'm saying in this little exchange is right, that we went from having a strong normative climate in schools to a period in which we do not, at least in most public schools, that would partially explain the decline. I can't go quite that far and say that, but I can at least put the evidence out there and say, well, there's something to this idea that it's the ethos of the school that matters. There was a question in the back that I didn't want to... I did? No.
You said amazing.
Oh, okay. Well, there we go. I like that answer. Not just by one. Come on.
I mean, given my position, I keep staring at these lines, and I mean, this is very intriguing. Dave, to what extent do you think your other background control variables control for time availability and variation in time availability that could be correlated with gender and years of education? Because I mean, we can figure the typical woman who only has a high school degree, she probably has a higher likelihood of single parenthood, more children, and that that would severely decrease her time available relative to the typical woman with a college degree. But with men, there's less of that relationship.
Go back to the controls
In
page.
fact, it might be the exact opposite. The man with a high school diploma and a blue collar job, is a 9-to-5er, and the person with a college or graduate degree is in the office working on Saturday.
The answer I'm about to give, I know, will not satisfy this audience. This is not one of these we don't know answers. No, this is an answer where we know, but it's one of those things where a lot of studies have confirmed what I'm about to say, and still people don't believe it. The evidence is pretty clear that there is basically no correlation between the amount of time you have available and how civically engaged you are. Oh, you do? Okay. Sid Verba, Henry Brady, and Kay Schlossman, about now 15 years ago, did a massive study on sort of every possible way that you could imagine getting involved in civic and community life. And they were very interested in this exact question. So they asked a lot of questions about how people use their time. And they just simply cannot find, to their surprise and the surprise of many, any evidence that having less free time available actually enables you to be more civically involved. If anything, it actually goes the other way. The old saw that if you want something done, you ask a busy person does seem to apply in the civic realm. But I know whenever I've said that to audiences, there are always some of the audiences that just can't possibly be true. And of course, like any social science finding, it can be true in general, in the aggregate, but not for every individual.
But go back to your square, go up about 2 or 3, yeah.
To this?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, and you use the word civic there. You've been looking at electoral, haven't you? The electoral index, isn't that what we've been looking at?
That was the picture that I showed you. Because the others, they didn't show an effect, so I didn't create a slide.
Yeah, so you didn't show those. But what you were just talking about was civic. It was in a different square.
Oh, well, okay. This is where the amorphousness of the term comes in. What I just described to you, that finding, applies to purely civic things like volunteering, but it also applies to more explicitly political activity. That is the finding that the amount of time you have available does not predict your involvement, even though your intuition tells you that it should. Surely busy people are so swamped that they can't possibly get involved, but it is.
But the chart you were showing us was the electoral index.
That's right, and that's because if I showed you the same sort of figure for the other measures, the lines wouldn't move. They would be, flat. There's no effect there.
For the interaction.
For the interaction, the slopes wouldn't differ. It'd be three lines together.
What is it?
Yeah, the absolute works because education is a universal solvent. It predicts everything.
But did you run that on the women? If you pulled it
Yes,
out,
yes, I did.
You did.
I did. Yeah, and I should mention that I also sliced it. I looked at blacks versus whites because I thought, actually, going into this, thought if there's going to be some sort of differentiation among the population that goes beyond age and place, well, I'm more likely to find it in race actually than in gender, but it turns out wrong. That's guess why we do the actual analysis. Funny thing. And that pesky reviewer greatly complicated my life.
Okay, well, I think we...
Thank you.
His provocative presentation.
And I really didn't mean to come and plug my book, but somehow...